Marhaba, and welcome to the ACT's Middle East Treasury Summit 2021. Under the patronage of the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Economy, we're thrilled that over 250 of you have chosen to join us online for this year's conference, ready to transform challenges into opportunities for strategic growth and to network with fellow delegates in the region. As many of you know, this is our second virtual Middle East Treasury Summit, and I'm proud that we've been able to stay connected through our fantastic series of virtual events, award-winning, in fact, that have been so positively received. A big thank you to all our sponsors and supporters who've helped us bring the region's Treasury and finance community together in one place for 2 exciting and stimulating days, with a special thank you to our gold sponsors, ADCB and Barclays Bank, and also Bank of America, Citi, Kyriba, Refinitiv, Swift, and Bottomline Treasury Express. Please do take time to familiarise yourself with the platform, which you can navigate using the side menu bar on the left. As well as being able to add sessions to your personal schedule through the Agenda tab, you also have 14 days to watch them by clicking the On Demand button to catch up on all your favourite topics. To network with your peers and forge new relationships, click onto a name from the list of attendees and start connecting by video call, phone, or chat. Do also browse around our exhibition hall, where you can find virtual stands from our sponsors who offer helpful downloadable resources, with representatives standing by virtually to receive your inquiries and to chat about all things Treasury. We hope you take the opportunity to involve yourself in the various discussions throughout the 2 days in our discussion forum, and have fun hunting for codes dotted around the platform as part of the ACT Treasury Hunt, where we have first, second, and third place prizes up for grabs in the form of Amazon vouchers. Here's a tip: collect extra points by visiting the stands of our gold sponsors and keep your eyes peeled during their sessions. And finally, there's our conference hall, which is where you are now and where the main event will take place in just a few moments, with an opening keynote address from Malik, Chief Economist, Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank, who will be talking about economics and trade with Rahul Daswani, member of the ACT's Middle East Advisory Panel. At 10:30, we'll continue with a session on our business of Treasury research, as well as a short presentation from me on developing your brand and enhancing personal resilience. And then at 11:25, we'll have our first of 8 Treasury Labs on access to liquidity. Just before we break for lunch, make sure you're tuned in at 12:10 for practical insights into API implementation in association with ADCB, which will draw from real experiences from treasurers who have gone through that process. At 1:40, we'll have 3 consecutive Treasury Labs in association with our sponsors, Citi, Refinitiv, and Swift. Then before we close for the day, there will be a thought-provoking discussion on the role of Treasury in the region and how developments in technology and automation are changing key priorities for today's treasurer in association with Barclays. Don't forget, everything is accessible to you on this platform for a further 14 days on demand, including pre-recorded content such as the Treasury 101 sessions for you to watch now or later on cash forecasting and working capital. Have a great Treasury Summit and see you again in a moment or two for the opening keynote address. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. A very warm welcome to ACT Middle East Summit. I'm sure all of you are pleased that this year also conference continues this virtual format. Hi, everybody. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the ACT Middle East Summit. We had a little bit of a technical glitch, but I guess we are starting off now. I am quite sure that all of you are pleased that this year also the conference continues with this virtual format. This allows all of our delegates like you to either log in safely from your offices or your homes, or even enjoy this content on demand. We will start this conference with a very engaging panel discussion on a few macroeconomic subjects. And it is my pleasure to introduce you today two very distinguished economists from this region. We have on the panel today Monica Malik with us, who is the chief economist at Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. She's a person that many of us in the industry know as what we call the go-to economist, because of her ability to analyze data across a variety of subjects for the Middle East. Joining Monica in the panel today is Scott Livermore. He's the chief economist and managing director of Oxford Economics. A lot of us think of think tanks, and then when we think of think tanks, we think of Scott. So it's really a pleasure that he could join us today. Each of them bring about 20 years of experience in macroeconomic subjects in the Middle East. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. May I request Monica and then Scott to introduce themselves, and then if possible, also share a fun fact about themselves. I'm sure all of us are taking in our coffee, so you will fairly enjoy hearing them speak. So handing over to you, Monica, and then Scott.
Thank you, Rahul. Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Malik. I'm the chief economist of ADCB Commercial Bank. I've been with the bank now for 7 years, but I've been in the region for over 15 years. I've been looking at GCC, MENA economies now for over 25 years. And thank you very much to include me in this panel. Rahul has asked us to provide a fun fact. One of my interests outside work is on Japan, and I'm interested in all aspects of Japanese history, culture, literature. I have a Japanese dog as a result, and I've taught him with flashcards all sorts of things, including colors, addition, answering yes and no questions. So that's just something a bit quirky about me. Thank you very much, and handing over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for the introduction, Rahul. As Rahul said, my name's Scott Livermore. I'm Chief Economist for Oxford Economics in the Middle East. I'm a Managing Director. Oxford Economics is the leading independent provider of economic analysis globally. I've been working for Oxford Economics for over 20 years now. I've been in Dubai for a couple of years, and prior to that, I spent 4 years in New York, where I headed the company in the US. As Rahul asked Monica, he also asked me to come up with a fun fact. I guess my fun fact is slightly less sophisticated than Monica, but despite being closer to 50 than 40, I've just recently taken up skateboarding in an effort to be cool to my kids. So back to you, Rahul.
Wow. So, we have a panel who is just not an expert on macroeconomic subjects, but on Japanese flashcards and skateboarding. I wish I had such good fun facts. And I would have hoped we would have a longer panel discussion. But unfortunately, we have a limited time. So, we will kind of get on with it. What I thought we could do today is that in the panel for all our delegates, the way I was thinking, we could cover a few topics today. I will initially start with asking Monica and Scott to both present some data on economic cycle, on let's say a couple of subjects. And then after that, we will dive into a few topics, which I think is quite topical and also top of mind for all of us. And on these subjects, we will have Monica and Scott engage in a conversation. So the objective would be you as audience get to hear perspectives from both. At this point of time, all of our delegates, all of you who have joined the conference also have a chat window on your screen, which is on the right-hand side. So feel free to drop your questions there, which we will address at an appropriate time. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first question, which I thought, we could have Monica and Scott share some, kind of macroeconomic views is, and I start with Monica first, and then, Scott. So Scott, please do add yours. Is, we've just come through a pandemic, and now, things are starting to move forward. So where do we stand on the economic recovery cycle, both globally and in the Middle East?
Thank you, Rahul. So of course, this year we expect global growth to pick up substantially as economies start the process of normalization. If we look at the IMF's growth forecasts that they did at the mid of the year, they expect global growth to rebound to about or to see growth of about 6% this year. However, this is going to be very, very uneven. And it's really going to be split by a number of factors. The key most factor is the pace of vaccination, access to vaccines, and that's really going to determine how quickly economies can start the normalization process and opening up. We also saw at the beginning of the year great variations in support that was provided by governments, by central banks, namely in the US, we saw very, very strong fiscal policy support measures as well. So it's going to be uneven, not only by countries, but also by the fact that we are still in the midst of this pandemic. We've had new waves of the Delta variant, particularly in Asia, parts of the US as well. And I believe that, compared to the mid of the year, that perhaps, there should be some deceleration or some revision down in global growth as a result of that. Increasingly also, we're seeing the pandemic shift to areas such as supply chain disruptions, shipping delays, and that's adding to global inflationary pressures. So that's going to be a really important point. Global growth is being impacted by that, and I think on a number of countries that drove the initial recovery, namely China, US, we're seeing growth having the growth momentum having peaked, and now is seeing a weaker momentum going forward. So that it's not going to be an even recovery. We are still in the midst of this pandemic, new waves, supply shortages, all of these are adding to more persistent signs of inflationary pressures as well. So, this is still something that we have to be mindful of. Now, again, sort of global emerging markets are generally seeing weaker vaccination rates, but within that, we see the GCC particularly standing out. Although, again, in the MENA, there's going to be the differential between the countries that have progressed well with vaccinations and others. Of course, GCC, we're seeing some of the fastest vaccination programs. most of the economies, particularly in the UAE, have been open for quite a while. We've not seen new lockdown or measures, although we have been impacted by new, over the summer or, changes in global regulation. But the positive sign is that, increasingly we're seeing more and more international openness. So, we think that that's going to be particularly important for the UAE, which is very externally facing for key sectors such as aviation, hospitality, and especially with Expo. We think that's going to be a very, very strong positive driver of growth. Also, with energy prices where they are, oil today back at around $80 per barrel for Brent crude, the increase in energy price, the gas prices, that's also very, very important for economic fundamentals. And we see that in a lot of our forecasts, whether it's the fiscal position, the external position. So, very well managed pandemic, both from the control of the pandemic domestically, openness of the economy, but also the OPEC plus management of the oil market. And we also see GCC countries contributing positively to make sure that they can add to the supply as there's tightness in the market. Scott, I'm sure you've got a lot of points you'd like to add to this, so if I could hand over to you.
Sure, and thank you, Monica. And despite what they say about the number of economists in the room and the number of opinions formed, I agree with a lot of what Monica said about the outlook. And there's probably a few points I'd like to make rather than go through the Oxford Economics story and replicate what Monica was saying. I think first point I'd like to make is that the global economy's recovered from the COVID crisis probably much better and much more quickly than we were expecting it would. So if we looked at our forecasts at the beginning of 2021, or even a year ago, we would have had a much weaker forecast than we have currently. Whereas we're expecting the economies of the world to get relatively close to pre-crisis trends over the next year or so. 6-12 months ago, we were expecting a lot more economic scarring. As Monica also said, I think despite that, the quick wins, the sharp bounce, so the rapid recovery is probably behind us. We see that if we look at some global survey metrics, whether it's the Purchasing Manager Indices or surveys around the world or high frequency indicators of trade, they've all dropped off slightly over the last few months, and industrial productions at global levels been broadly flat over the course of the past 6 months. And as Monica highlighted, that's really down to two factors: the Delta variant taking hold and the supply chain issues that are very much in the press, whether it's fast food outlets running out of chicken, UK petrol drying up on the forecourts, or semiconductors. But it's relatively widespread around the economy, these degrees of shortages. And there's some headwinds the global economy is going to face, and one of the reasons we think we're past the peak. However, we remain relatively optimistic about the outlook. If you look at the US and the Eurozone and UK, broadly similar forecasts, around 5.5%, 6% GDP growth this year, 4.5%, 5% next year. So really strong bounce back, much stronger than after the global financial crisis. And that brings you back to very close to pre-crisis trends. What we think is the driver and what's critical for the short-term outlook is the consumer. It's what households do. If you look at what's happened around the world, then we've had lockdowns, so people haven't been able to spend. We've certainly in Europe and the US, and to a degree Asia, we've had a lot of support. So household incomes actually maintained really well. And if you look across developed countries, there's kind of 5 to 10% of GDP in excess savings, so more savings than people would have otherwise. And we believe and we expect that to be gradually released over the forecast period. To date, households haven't really done it. Consumption is broadly where it was pre-crisis, and there's a big area under the curve that needs to be made up, and that's critical for driving the forecast. Against this background, we think policy will be withdrawn, and that's really one of the big challenges facing both governments and central banks, to withdraw policy at a rate to allow the private sector to step in and ensure strong recovery and not cause issues. Now, some of these issues are at play in the Middle East, but maybe to a lesser degree. Clearly, we haven't had such social support, so there's not a degree of excess savings. But clearly, we've not been able to spend or go out in how we would have been prior to the crisis. So there is some pent-up demand. But much of what will drive the growth in the Middle East, and we are relatively positive about the outlook in the GCC in particular, even if it lags the rest of the world slightly, is that strengthening domestic demand I talked about, opening up borders that Monica talked about, so travel coming back, clearly very important for the UAE, but also in the other countries, be it religious tourism in Saudi Arabia, visitors to Bahrain and Oman, critically important. But I think in contrast to the rest of the world, we're likely to see the fiscal sector become more engaged and more stimulative. And whether that's the Public Investment Fund and Agenda 2030 in Saudi Arabia, or whether that's policies associated with 50th anniversary in UAE, we're much more likely to have the public sector driving the recovery in the Middle East, in those countries that can afford it. Clearly, there are some exceptions, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit later.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Monica. Really a good summary, and the takeaways I took was that we see better recovery than expected. This is something all of we concur. I think that vaccination rates are driving growth. We see that the service sector will benefit from this recovery now, and UAE specifically will take a rub-on effect from that. Very nice to see that overall both of you are optimistic about the outlook, which is a good consensus to have. And I think I took a good takeaway from you, Scott, was that the fiscal sector in this part of the world will probably engage more, unlike what has happened in the developed economies already. That gives us a very good takeaway to move into our second topic. And I thought, what we could talk today, beyond the rosy outlook, is this subject on oil economies. So we know that the Middle East economies have been closely associated with the oil prices. So what's really, today, of course, Brent is trading at 80. But what is the near-term outlook for oil prices and oil demand is something, we would like to discuss. The other question in my mind has been, is OPEC plus now in a state of equilibrium? And, what is the range we expect, oil prices to trade in? And then, of course, the biggest elephant in the room is climate change. So what is the effect we think climate change will have on oil prices? Is that effect something we think in the short term? And when I say short term, is it in the next 2 to 3 years? Or are we seeing that effect only in 2030? So I will hand it over to you, maybe Scott, for you to start with, and then Monica, and then, happy for both of you to also engage in a conversation on this subject.
Okay, thank you, Rahul. And I think that's a really important point to highlight around the outlook for the Middle East. And I guess the first thing I'll say is I bet the governments of the region are incredibly relieved with how oil prices have come back, and they've been able to move from a situation of trying to balance the budget, cut spending, raise taxes, to be really much more growth orientated, as I was mentioned previously. If I look at the oil market, maybe I see it as a play, and there's really maybe 3 acts. And the first act is the very short term. As we've seen, oil prices are back around, and I talk about Brent crude oil prices when I talk about oil prices, around $80 a barrel. We have some in the market, Goldman's, for example, thinking they could go up to $90 plus by the end of the year. And I think there's probably definite scope for short-term increases in oil prices. If you look at some of the drivers whether it's the drawdown on US inventories, aftermath of Hurricane Ida, some production issues in OPEC plus countries, that they're all limiting supply. And we're going into the winter months where typically demand tends to be a bit higher. And the final fact, if you look at the gas market, which has seen a significant rise in price, supply disruption, there may be some switching from gas to oil, which puts a floor of an impulse under oil prices over the next 3 months. The second act is if you look over the next to 12 to 18 months. And here we don't see another super cycle in oil prices. We think there's some overshooting in the market, and we expect some of the tight control on oil supply to be eased over the next 12 months. Partly that'd be OPEC plus. We see it with the UAE and other members. They're really keen to pump more oil and ease the shackles, if you like. And I think we're probably at a price level of $80 where prices may be a bit higher for their comfort zone. OPEC plus doesn't want too high prices. And then if you look in other parts of the world, the US may be increasing production. There's chances of Libyan or Iranian oil supply coming on stream. All factors that kind of shift the market from excess demand to slightly excess supply. And then we therefore expect oil prices to edge down next year. So moving back to around $65 a barrel. And then, as you describe it, the final act, the longer term, the elephant in the room, great green transition. And I think that's having a couple of impacts. Firstly, it's making those with excess capacity, particularly at OPEC, really keen to pump the oil, because this could be the last hurrah of high oil prices. So that's behind some of the disruptions on OPEC plus disagreements. And I think to your big question, when will this weigh on oil prices? I think inevitably will hit demand, and most of the scenarios and forecasts have it relatively gradual. So it's more of a trend decline in oil prices, which makes it easier to manage. I think the big fear and the big concern is, will the oil market, and particularly the car sector, have its Kodak moment? So when would a combustion engine suddenly become old technology in the way Kodak cameras did, and the bottom falls out the market? And then that's really hard to manage, and it really does go back a little bit to explain some of the anxieties some producers have about realizing the value of the wealth they currently have. I don't know what you think about the outlook for the oil market, Monica.
Well, again, Scott, we should do these conferences more often together, because there's a big degree of consensus between us. So, very much I like your 3 acts, very much in line. I think, also, if I could bring in some of the global forecasts, there's quite a difference in when, large forecasters, energy agencies think that we're going to hit the peak demand, and what does it mean for oil prices. So, of course, one agency, the IEA, has been very much talking about that. They see sort of oil prices sort of falling quite sharply as we get between 2030 to 2040, and that's going to be sort of sub 50. Even going to something like sub 40 at one point. I agree with Scott that I think it is going to be very gradual. If we look at the developments so far, renewables have been more a complementary aspect to the overall energy supply and energy source. And increasingly, we do see that increasing, but, I think it will be gradual. But I think also it's quite important to highlight how the GCC, from an energy perspective, is really focusing on this. So I think, in the UAE, there's been a focus on developing clean energies. We've seen, the nuclear power plants in Abu Dhabi coming online. We see in both Dubai, Abu Dhabi, a lot of solar developments. We're seeing that spreading across the GCC. That's a big part of Saudi. And also we think that, hydrogen is going to be an important part of this energy mix. And really, again, UAE, Saudi, Oman are really going to focus on this in the coming sort of years. It's both from the solar side, for green ammonia, but also for blue ammonia from the gas side. Our view is also that even though oil will eventually reach a peak and start to decline, gas is going to be a very, very important part of the energy mix in the coming decades. So, for example, in Abu Dhabi, where I am, there's going to be a lot of focus on the development of the gas industry. So very, very proactive stance on that. And, of course, the other side, Scott had mentioned the fiscal improvement. We've also seen, over the last few years after oil fell sharply in 2014, focus on strengthening the fiscal position. So we've seen introduction of VAT. We've also seen sort of structural measures to reduce government spending. Now, more needs to be done. More needs to be done on diversification as well. But at least, we're seeing that focus on maximizing oil revenue, a lot of investment going into new energy, cleaner energy, gas capture, decarbonizing the hydrocarbon sector. So I think policymakers are being very proactive on this front.
I think one thing to add to that is clearly over the long term, the countries in the region have to deal with the global energy transition. But I think it's also important to remember that in a declining market, it's often the strongest that survive and can do quite well. You can look at markets around the world, with tobacco, etc., where market demand is shrinking, but you still have strong companies. You don't have a lot of broad set of companies. And if you look at who's got the cheapest oil to extract, who can survive and live with oil prices and shrinking demand, then that's the region here. And as I say, that shouldn't breed complacency, but it does create an opportunity and some time to invest in renewable technology, to invest in carbon capture, invest in systems to make blue hydrogen much more effective, and make good use of fossil fuels rather than just being polluted. And I think hydrogen, a lot of the focus here will be on hydrogen. I think at the moment it's a technology that in theory promises a lot, but we haven't reached the stage of technological maturity to make it viable. But if the effort, the R&D and the investment goes in there, then that could be really important because it really helps clean the oil of energy consuming countries.
Quite interesting to hear both of you, Scott and Monica. And I remember some years ago in the oil market, every discussion was around shale and how shale prices will make sure that oil will never hit $80 again. I even remember reading articles on that subject. So clearly that has not happened. And now the new challenge, which unfortunately is climate change, which is a real threat to to everybody on this planet. And what I hear from you that even on that side, we are a little bit early in the cycle because maybe the transition right now is away from coal and not necessarily away from oil and gas, because our transportation system is fairly dependent. And as Scott, as you were saying, hydrogen is still a technology which is being tested. So I think a very good summary. And I also like how you talked about in a declining market, the stronger shall survive. So we will still see maybe oil prices, as you said, Monica, continue to remain slightly elevated, and maybe this is a much longer story. And hopefully we will cover this again when we have another conference maybe next year, a subject which is of course always of interest. In conscious of time, I would like to move to another topic which I think will be very engaging for the audience. Subject which is and we'll try to weave in a story around oil and also in this is jobs and manufacturing. Now, these are the two words which we now hear from the leaders, of both developed economies and developing economies. And earlier it used to be that you hear only the developing economies talk about it, but now we see it from all the leaders. So there is clearly a desire in many countries to develop their own workforce, which is bent around manufacturing. One could argue that there is still, old legacy thinking that manufacturing drives jobs, but assuming that being, a relevant subject in today's context also, how should we expect the strategies to evolve, around the Middle East countries? And happy to hear your subject, even your thoughts on even individual countries versus just Middle East as a whole, because I think the Middle East countries are looking to develop a vibrant non-oil economy also as we hear 2030 and beyond. So they are very concerned about keeping their population employed. So where do you see the strategies shaping up, on this front? So I'll start with you, Monica, and then Scott, if you could add your context also.
Okay, I mean, I'll focus on the region, but I'll just as a interesting point about the pandemic and the global labor market is that we are seeing sort of some changes in the labor markets after the pandemic, both in how business is being conducted, greater digitization. I think the pandemic very much speeded up the reforms on those sides. There's a lot of work on, when we talk about manufacturing, it's also how technology is changing, as they call it, the fourth industrial revolution. But also what we're seeing is that as people have come out of this pandemic, we're seeing significant tightness in the labor market in the US, UK, etc., where people are looking at where they want to work, how they want to work, and rebalancing their lives as well. So I think that's been an interesting aspect of the pandemic globally, and of course that's also one reason why we see, for example, inflation in the US remaining higher and more persistent because of the tightness in the labor market and then increase in wage pressures as well. Moving to this region, it's not only in the GCC, but the wider MENA region. I think, one of the biggest challenges is going to be on the labor market front. There's a large youth population, and it's really the case of job creation for this youth population. And we saw these sort of, if we look back over the last decade or so, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. A big part of that in some of the North African countries, etc., was the job opportunities, access to certain type of jobs, education, etc. GCC countries, it's going to, again, it's very young population, and the pressures are different. I mean, for all the countries, there's the need to create jobs, but the pressures are great in countries such as Saudi, Oman, and Bahrain, than the other countries such as UAE, which have either more diversified economy or also have a smaller population relative to the hydrocarbon endowment. So I think that's a distinguishing fact. But we've seen, for example, over the last few years, a number of initiatives by governments to create jobs for the national population. In Saudi Arabia, that's been very, very much front and center. They have the Saudiization program, the job nationalization program, and that's been something that has resulted in more job creation for the nationals and the expatriate population declining. That's also been very, very much visible in Oman as well. So you can see that as being very, very important. Now, from an economic perspective as well, it's very, someone who's a national, who earns, who spends the money here, who saves the money here, has a much bigger multiplier than someone who remits the money home. But at the same time, it was announced last week, a big employment reform drive in Saudi Arabia, where the labor force has to meet the requirements of the private sector. So it's both on the skills, the knowledge, but also the cost and the competitiveness as well. That's going to be a critical point on that side as well. In the UAE, we've also got, we're seeing the initiatives, 50 initiatives linked to the 50-year anniversary of the UAE, and that's very much linked to aspects related to this. It's productivity, competitiveness of the economy. We've seen a number of moves to liberalize the economy to help develop the new industries, new sectors developing, create jobs. Part of the package is also creating jobs for nationals in the private sector. And so you can see this is very much there. There's also competition between, the different GCC economies as well, because we've seen Saudi to make some moves again, on getting headquarters moved to Saudi Arabia if the business is going to be done there. There's been the measures of customs on goods, on some goods based on criteria that are produced on GCC free trade zones. So there is that sort of competition to create the jobs, to create the industry, focus on developing new industries in these areas, but also, competitiveness, focus on educational reforms, research and development. But I think this also very much plays into the fiscal reforms, the earlier question of climate change and lower oil prices, because governments are no longer in the position to be the employer of last resort, to create the jobs for the nationals. That's both as the population has increased, but also the outlook of oil. And a big part of that will be the private sector creating jobs. But then you need a productive and competitive private sector. So the reforms to support that. Scott, over to you.
Yeah, and I'll try to be relatively brief. So I think there's an interesting shift of landscape around the Middle East. And I guess I try to summarize it in the other big diversification that needs to happen. We talk a lot about diversifying from hydrocarbons to the non-oil sector, but a really big diversification need for local employment in the Middle East is from public sector to private sector. And to different degrees, we're seeing that across the region and different approaches to it. So very much in the UAE, to a lesser degree, Qatar, it's about attracting talent and foreign investment to the region with the aim that a rising tide floats all ships, so it really benefit everyone, and that's a lot of what the policy focus has been in the UAE. In Saudi Arabia, it's like spending big. Let's have this development. There's a fear about leakage, so there's a lot more policy to guide and reduce the leakage, and Saudi does need to create a lot of jobs given its very young population and new entrants into the labour force. And then you have countries like Kuwait and Oman who have become much more insular, and they still need to diversify away from the public to private sector, but it's very much in a way, let's crowd out and let's kind of in place, put locals in private sector jobs. And in those countries, you're much more likely to see the expat population diminish, and it's much more of a replacement process rather than a positive economic dynamic.
Yeah, quite interesting. And I sometimes think about this as that the countries and the leaders of are looking to create jobs of the future, as I call it. And that's very much close to my heart because I'm a father of two small children, still in school. So really to see what would be the jobs of the future, and I think there are a lot of, there has been so much news around competitiveness, and Monica, you touched upon this, competitive even within GCC countries. But there is while there is a fear around that subject, but there is a positive side to it also, because it is competitiveness which will actually create the jobs of the future. And unfortunately, nobody knows the future except when you try to create it. So while there is a perfect storm in some ways, but hopefully at the end there will be some light at the end of the tunnel, because the region, as you correctly pointed out, Scott, is ripe for this transformation. I will pause now and see if we have any questions from the audience. And there is one question, which is the diversification of the GCC economies from oil taking place fast enough? So I will let, maybe, Scott, you go first, and then Monica, a little bit of your context on the pace of change.
So fast enough is such a difficult thing to capture. I think there is a temptation, if you look at some of the headline indicators, that especially around Saudi, whether it's diversification of revenues, jobs in the private sector, some of those key metrics, to suggest it's not moving as fast as you want. But I think the important thing to remember is, certainly after the last 18 months, there's been a lot of positive policy moves across the region, not just in Saudi and UAE, which will bear fruit in terms of long-term economic growth, attracting FDI, boosting competitiveness. And in order to achieve that in a sustainable way, it's much more of a marathon than a sprint. And we're relatively, certainly for the likes of Saudi and Kuwait and the countries other than Qatar and the UAE, we're still very early in that race. And some of the impacts are likely to come through further in the forecast horizon if they stay on track.
I would agree with that. I think what we've really seen is the pace of reforms pick up. And it's, I would start on, the fiscal side, which I've touched upon. Now it's the competitiveness, it's trying to develop new industries. I think also, as I had highlighted, I think they're trying to be very much in the forefront of the climate change. And again, I think it's UAE that stands out, as in, the trying to move forward development of new industries. Saudi Arabia is very much a transformational change. We've seen the social changes has helped develop new sectors. We're moving fast on areas such as that. But, there are differences, as Scott mentioned. Kuwait has seen very little reforms. We've seen, sort of no changes to how much oil contributes either to the economy or to the fiscal position. So there are variations, and we are in different stages of the cycle. But I think what we've seen is policymakers are now seeing that areas that were previously seen as difficult to touch or might be socially sensitive, we've seen reforms around those areas. And I think that's going to sort of increasingly embolden reform going ahead as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very good summary from both of you. And I think what I take away is that, just like, we've in the past seen different countries be on different, points of the curve. So the pace will be different in different countries. Some will be ahead of the others. We are nearly reaching the end of the conference on the session. I had actually one question listed out, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about it if there is no other question from the panel. So the question I had was, we are just about to kick off Expo 2020. There is this, the next big one is the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, and then we have later on the Saudi Vision 2030 also putting out some of his action items. So quite a lot of things in motion. The question is, have we already seen the impact of this on the economic growth rates? And, what do we expect to see in the coming years? And let's do it quick 2-minute from both of you so that, we have enough time to close here.
Okay, well, I mean, I think we've already started seeing some of the benefits of that. Both the FIFA and Expo, we've seen that driving the construction boom in Dubai and Qatar. We'll now see the benefits of higher visitor numbers, higher spending. For the UAE, for Dubai, I think it's going to be a wonderful showcase at a time when they're trying to, show the innovation, show the focus on future technology, show the connectivity of the city by transportation, its openness. I think it's going to be a fantastic opportunity to show where Dubai is, the fact that it has been open, and the focus on technology across the UAE. So I think that there are going to be very, very positive developments on that. And I think, of course, the FIFA World Cup is going to not only benefit Qatar with visitor numbers as well, it's going to benefit sort of the transportation and hospitality in the UAE. In Saudi, it's going to be, 2030, it's going to be a multi-year process. But again, we are seeing a lot of the reforms on that side, the social changes, the opening up of the economy. As another fun fact, I actually did my PhD on Saudi Arabia in the 1990s. And if you go from then to where we are now, it's an incredible change. And, it's going to be very, very broad-based. The change in the way society works. I think it'll take time for people to see Saudi internationally as a holiday destination. I love going there, but I think, there's a lot to offer, and it's going to be a very interesting transformation to watch.
Yeah, I think these major events can have a potentially significant impact. Clearly, everyone thinks about the event themselves, the foot traffic, how many people are going to come, and that's important. But if you think about how they transform the economy, first it's through the infrastructure and the legacy that leaves and how it helps the economy function, whether it connects to the rest of the world, train stations, development areas. And all these big events will leave a significant footprint there. And then probably more importantly, as Monica mentioned, if you put it in business speak, it's a huge marketing endeavor. If you present these countries as open, successful, innovative, transformation, leaders in fields, countries you want to visit, countries you want to live in, countries you want to invest in, as well as complement those with all the supply side reforms we're seeing, then the legacy, although harder to discern compared to the event itself, could have quite a long-term impact and help with some of the things we've been discussing so far about diversifying the economies, generating jobs, and boosting the economic outlook.
Thank you, Scott. What a nice summary. To all the panelists, this has really been a very engaging discussion for me. I've learned a lot, and I hope the audience has absolutely enjoyed the session. Thank you both for participating, and we will now break for the next session.